Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Kausar Ahmed, and on behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, I welcome all of you to today's 15th episode of webinar. Today's episode is very interesting and very important given the situation unfolding in the Middle East. And today we are very honored to be joined by two educators from Canada, those who would be speaking on this particular issue. As a formality and tradition, before we start the session, we acknowledge the land and where we are currently located. So, the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute of Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So this is what is the start of our session today. And just to set a brief context, and then I will introduce our two main panelists and two observers, those who have joined today's session. So Israeli government's latest declaration to annex 30% of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank provides a huge backdrop and movement in the whole political arena in the Middle East and beyond. And on this backdrop, let me quote some of the parts of a recent article that was written by Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimer, and it was published on August 13th of this year in an opinion piece. Dr. Abu Nimer is saying that, and the title of his article is Confronting Israel's Annexation Plans from Fear to Hope. And this is what particularly intrigued me to share his part of the articles here. So he's saying that it's a destructive policy decision in such a protracted conflict reality. Obviously, this is not the first time that the Israeli government attempted to annex all or certain territories that were occupied in 67. It was already annexed the Golan Heights and created a non-reversible reality on the ground. So he's also saying that it's a decrease in hope for mobilizing support for a two-state solution. In an annexation scenario, this is no longer accepted as viable or even perceived as possible by the overwhelming majority of Palestinians and Israelis. And a recent poll by Haaretz, one of the leading newspapers in Israel, indicated 25 years after the signing of the Oslo Accords, which promised two states for two peoples, only a third, that means 34%, said they still back the two-nation solution. 19% prefer a one-state solution. They were not asked to specify whether Palestinians would have political rights within such an option. And 27% said they wanted something different altogether. One option, backed by 9% of the respondents, was an Israeli-Palestinian confederation in which each state would govern itself while some matters would be overseen together. So let's have a brief context of this today's discussion here from the piece written by Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimer. And as you know, July 1st is the date when Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced plans for the annexation of the part of the Jordan Valley in the West Bank, occupied Palestinian territories. Given the current state of the world, it should come as no surprise that this announcement has heightened uncertainty and anxiety within communities and organizations dedicated to peace building in Israel and Palestine. As facilitator of the dialogue on peace, our first panelist today, Mr. Izzeddin Hawamda, and our second panelist from Carleton University, Leah, felt it was necessary to open a space for dialogue about the impact of annexation that may have impacted the lives of the people in the region and also in the diasporas, as well as on the broader potential for authentic, inclusive peace building. So, Conflict and Resilience Research Institute is very proud to offer its platform to have this dialogue so that we have constructive ideas about the resolution of this, I would say, very protracted conflict. And ladies and gentlemen, today we are also joined by Dr. Hilal Mohiuddin, who is the Director of Research and Communication with the CRRIC, and our fellow Rotarian peace builder and a known figure in Winnipeg Rotarian Peace Building Committee, David G. Newman. So we will listen to their perspectives after the presentation offered by Izzeddin, Hawamda, and Leah. So, floor is yours, and we can start listening to your discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the great welcome, Dr. Kautar Ahmed. I want to extend a welcome, a great welcome to Dr. Muhyiddin, and of course our great friend David Newman. We're super excited to be with you today to talk about something very personal to me as a Palestinian and of great importance to our community here in Winnipeg. And it should be highlighted and it's talked about in every possible chance. We're here to talk about annexation, but we're here to talk about the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. We're here to talk about the stories of the two nations and the people of those two places, as they are going to be greatly impacted by such a move if it was to go ahead and to be implemented by the Israeli government. As someone who was born and raised in the West Bank in the city of Nablus, I am very connected to the people of the West Bank. My home is there, my family is there, my farmland is there. The occupation of Palestine has impacted me and impacted my family for generations now. So this topic is not only of great importance from its political and analytical stand of view, but also on a personal level. Before I go ahead and start talking about this topic, I'd like to acknowledge the group that I am here to represent and to be very proudly to be part of, which is JISR. JISR stands for bridge, which means JISR means bridge, and it's the same word in Arabic and Hebrew. Our group tries to promote dialogue and reconciliation between the Jewish and the Muslim community in Winnipeg. We are a group that promotes peace building and empathy building here in the city of Winnipeg. So today we are hoping to acknowledge different sides of annexation. What does it mean for the people of Palestine particularly, and how it can prevent any further peace talks between the two sides. So that's a little bit about me. I'll let Leah talk about, introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Izzeddin, and thanks to the CRRIC for hosting this informative and I think engaging and necessary conversation to be having in Winnipeg, a human rights hub, a place where we thrive through our diversity, but we also see conflict amongst communities. And I think it's really important to be able to have these open dialogues and these discussions. So I just want to thank the CRRIC for creating this space for us. So I myself am a settler on Treaty 1 land in Winnipeg currently, and have come to this work through a passion for social justice and human rights. Unlike Izzeddin, my family is not from the West Bank or from traditional Palestine or the current state of Israel. So I have come to this work through my passion for human rights, my engagement in it. And as we continued this conversation, I'll go into a little bit more of a depth into what that means. But I'll pass it over to Izzeddin to start us off.
Thank you, Leah. To start it off, I would like to set some background here about annexation, and just to give a little bit of a background. Of course, the announcement that was made by Netanyahu on July 1st, 2020 is not the first policy or the first news item that talked about or hinted to annexation or more annexation of the Palestinian land. In fact, the annexation policy of Israel has been there since '67, and much of the Palestinian land in the West Bank has been annexed due to the expansion of settlement in the West Bank and the policy of land confiscation in the West Bank. So this is not something new to the Palestinians, and not surprising given the status and the direction that the Israeli government government under Netanyahu has been following for the past few years. So the attempt to annex the Palestinian territory in the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, of course, creates a lot of fear for Israelis and Palestinians who have for so long tried to work on promoting peace and finding a solution that is fair and just for both sides. So for those people who are trying to seek reconciliation and have been working for years to try to promote a peaceful solution, news like this, policies like this, puts and creates a lot of fear for them and puts them in a place where a place of uncertainty, and of course destroys any potential for peace talks or for the two-state solution. Secondly, the two-state solution, which was agreed upon after the Oslo Accord, promised the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank, and that has not seen the light for the past 25 years. So many Palestinians living in the West Bank under occupation are still holding on to the vital dream of their Palestinian state on the 67 border and East Jerusalem as a capital. We, as Palestinians, also hope that we would be granted recognition by the international community and, of course, by Israel, and to live side by side with Israel. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of those issues, but I'm also going to talk to you about how this policy of annexation could impact and will impact people on the ground, people who have farmed in the West Bank, who had lived in the West Bank for generations, and it will eventually put the peace process or whatever is left of it at a very tough place, and put an end to the peace talk between Palestinians and the Israelis. So why should we talk about the annexation? First of all, as a farmer, someone living in the Palestinian territories, my grandfather and my grandmother have farmed the land for generations. If you look at the picture here displayed in the PowerPoint, that barbed wire right there separates my village and the settlement next to my village. The settlement that is nearby my village has been there since the late 80s. And because of the establishment of this settlement, a lot of my friends, family, and of course people from my village have lost their land that they used to farm and of course got their livelihood from. Because of this settlement also, a lot of us in our village are not allowed to go and see and farm and take care of our land. So for the Palestinians living in the West Bank, annexation has already been happening for over 30 years. So the policy of continuing this annexation, or continuing the talk about annexing more land in the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, only creates more fear on the Palestinian side, and puts people who are seeking peace and peaceful resolution with Israel in a very uncertain place, because from this point on, how do you reconcile with a government that is trying to take whatever is left of land, and of course hope, for that matter, for the Palestinians to create their own state? So as a founder of CRRIC, a group that promotes peace, we are trying to talk about this issue from a personal point of view, from a human side, and how it can impact people on the ground. As I said earlier, the inability to go to the settlement or to practice farming for my family and the village and the people in my village had put a lot of pressure on our village economically and of course spiritually, because we are connected to the land. So when through CRRIC we try to use the tool of conflict transformation to build empathy on both sides. The idea is to, as a lot of us know, the Palestinian Israelis have tried for so long to find a solution to the problem or the conflict. And unfortunately, we have failed on many levels. So conflict transformation allows the Israelis and the Palestinians to begin an understanding of each other's perspective. The idea is to try to build empathy through dialogue. The unfortunate situation in the West Bank is that a lot of the communities living side by side, the Israelis and the Palestinian communities, do not talk to each other. They don't know each other very well, and therefore an atmosphere of fear is created, and policies like the ones that the government of Israel trying to put forward actually has a very chance of being implemented due to the lack of knowledge and due to the lack of opposition from the Israeli society. So the conflict transformation model or conflict transformation tool will allow people from both sides, from the Israeli society and the Palestinian society, to stand united together to stop such a policy and to oppose such a policy. But to get there, alternative perspectives on the conflict, a step towards humanization, of course, seeing your neighbor as a human is necessary. Second, please. Here is, I don't know if you can see the map, but this is a map of the West Bank where I come from. And I deliberately put this map here just to show you the situation on the ground right now in the West Bank. And this is, of course, the occupied territories of the West Bank. So if you look at the city of Nablus, you see that the green color belongs or is under the Palestinian Authority. As someone who lives in the West Bank, I know better to say that this area is actually under the Palestinian Authority. It is mostly controlled by Israeli checkpoints. It is heavily and mostly influenced by the Israeli military. To be able to go from one city to another, you must pass and go through checkpoints where the Israeli soldiers check for your identifications and allow you or not allow you to pass through. So if you also take a look at this map, you notice that there is those small triangles referring to the Israeli settlements, and the red lines also referring to the wall or the fences. If you have noticed that the Israeli settlements broke down the Palestinian territory. So if you look at those settlements, they're strategically built within certain parts of Palestine or certain parts of the West Bank to separate east from west, to split entire cities and towns from each other. So in many cases, if you are living in Jericho, for example, and you happen to have a friend or a cousin or a family member in a different village, before the settlement was built, near your village or in your village, you were able to visit each other, go to each other freely. But these settlements now prevent the Palestinians from free movement, from the ability to go and have a livelihood, to farm, to go from one place to another. And therefore, more annexation of what is left of the Palestinian land in the West Bank will make it nearly impossible for a Palestinian state to exist, for the Palestinian dream of recognition, for self-actualization, for a statehood to be a reality. So in one view here, our lives in the West Bank has been impacted greatly because of policies of annexation, policies of occupation, and of course the tightened presence of militarized of military that is present in every part of the West Bank. As someone who lives in Nablus, if I wanted to take a trip to Jerusalem, a trip that usually should take in theory 2-3 hours, it probably end up taking me about a day if I am lucky, if I can actually go through the checkpoints. So when we talk about full annexation of what is left for the Palestinians to imagine their own state on, we're talking about destruction, full destruction of the Palestinian hopes for a state of their own, and of course the killing of any peace or further peace talks between the two sides, and therefore the death for the peace process. And also, it is important to mention here, by going on to add more or to take more land and to annex more land from the West Bank, Israel is directly violating international law, and therefore Israel should be held responsible, and the international community should apply pressure to stop Israel from further annexation. Next, please. One slide or one aspect of living in the West Bank, of course, and hearing the news of more annexation is trauma. As someone living in the West Bank, I always talk to people who come from Palestine. I'm very connected with the Palestinian community here in Winnipeg. We always talk about what it means to be an occupied person, and one thing that comes up all the time is that we as Palestinians don't know how to separate, to identify outside of the conflict. In so many ways, our identities as people, as Palestinians, have been mingled and mixed with the conflict, and that's who we are as a result of the conflict. So stress, anxiety, of course, PTSD, all are present and featured in the life of Palestinians in the West Bank. Not to say that the Israelis who live in the West Bank or in Israel do not face similar traumas. Of course they do. And Jisr promotes dialogue by talking about traumas faced by both sides, stresses and anxieties faced and fears faced by both sides. And the idea is to try to talk about these traumas and stresses in an open dialogue where people from both sides can see each other as humans, can start to relate to each other experiences, and to try to build empathy. As someone from the West Bank, I have not had the opportunity to speak to an Israeli citizen living in Israel or to engage with them on any conversations. It wasn't until I moved to Canada that I was able to make friends from Israel and to have friends from Israel and to be able to talk about these conversations openly. And when we start talking about some of these conversations, we quickly realize that there's a lot of common grounds that we share. One of the common things that we share is, of course, our love for the land. So conflict transformation tools can be applied here, where that love of the land, the idea that we do not share the land, it is there it is there for us to live on, of course, can be used to help bring and build bridges between the two communities. Of course, trauma comes in the form of physical trauma, where both sides face physical trauma. The Israelis, of course, from violence, the rockets being launched in Israel, and of course the Palestinians on the other side, the trauma that they face as a result of occupation, and the checkpoints, and of course the night raids, and so on and so on. So all of this happens and had happened for the past 30 so years. So further talks about annexation, more annexation of the land, if it was to go ahead, would mean increasing of trauma on the Palestinian side, and of course it would be a huge roadblock for the peace process and for further negotiations. Next. It is important to acknowledge human rights when we are talking about annexation. It is important to talk about what are those human rights and why Israel needs to recognize them for the Palestinians. It would be a great stepping stone and a good place to start to talk about what it means to be human, what it means to have rights, what are those rights, and how do we acknowledge and respect and recognize these rights for both sides. Once we understand these rights, we can understand that further annexation of territory, of land, would mean violation of human rights, and of course, a violation of human life. As a Palestinian living in the West Bank, once you confiscate or annex my land, my farm, you're directly impacting my livelihood. You're directly impacting my narrative. You're directly impacting my agency, and therefore my human rights as a whole are impacted. So it is important to talk about human rights and why we need to be able to acknowledge these human rights and to uphold these human rights for both sides when we talk about this topic. Of course, the potential for conflict transformation is great, and it is important here by recognizing humanity, which is something that the Israelis and the Palestinians are still working on, to try to see each other as humans, as a first step to build empathy and as a first step to recognize mutual human rights on both sides. This starts from many places. But as an educator, I would promote, and of course I promote the place. A good place to start is education, where we talk about human rights for both people. We talk about human rights, and of course human value and the human lives as a very important part of the whole entire phenomena when it comes to Palestine and Israel. And therefore, it is important to have people from both sides, grassroots movements, educators, neighbors, workers, teachers, to get engaged in direct dialogue and to build empathy between each other. Next. I will stop here. This is where Leah will take on. And we will come back to share our shared vision for Palestine and Israel. But before I go on, I think it is important to also recognize that further annexation of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley puts so many lives at stake. We're talking about the Jordan Valley, where we have farmers who are dependent 100% on their land, on their livestock. So when you remove them, systemically remove them off their land, you are putting them in a very dangerous place. So the world needs to recognize, and the international community needs to recognize, that annexation should stop, and annexation should be prevented for the sake of human life and the sake of humanity. And of course, as a place to start a conversation, a real conversation between the Palestinians and the Israelis, in hopes of finding a peaceful solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Izzeddin. Are you able to share for the other slides? Perfect. Okay. Thanks for sharing, Izzeddin. I always truly appreciate the passion and just the vigor that you bring to this conversation. I think we need more people engaged like yourself who are really willing to listen, because I think it's so easy, like you had mentioned, to recognize traumas and therefore get identifying with the barriers to communication. But to be able to have that open dialogue is so important, and is really like the root start of conflict transformation that we hope to see. So just like diverse groups in the land that we identify as Canada see this land as home, very diverse groups see the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River as their homes. When I had the opportunity to travel to Israel and Palestine in 2018, and again for a longer practicum opportunity in 2019, I saw fragments of people and societies that were impacted by this long-lasting, multi-generational traumas. While they are not the same traumas, they certainly have parallels in some ways, and that has impacted the way that people live their expressions and the way that they can live their lives. But while I also saw that, I saw joy and celebration, love, and a longing for home. The identification with the land in both Israel and Palestine that people have with it is something that I have seen in very few other contexts. People really recognize themselves in who they were and who they identified with as being reflected in the land. And so I think in order to have conversations where we're really able to engage in this, we need to break down these barriers. And that first and foremost starts with recognizing a lot of the human rights in context that deserve to be upheld. Annexation is a violation of human rights in multiple aspects, and I'll go into that a little bit later in detail. I just want to highlight the photo in this graphic. It's of East Jerusalem, which, as Izzeddin alluded to earlier, is a contentious area because it's seen as the home for Palestinians and the capital of Jerusalem to them. But it's also a place where you're seeing appropriation of land, and you're seeing annexation of parts of East Jerusalem itself right now. And so I just put this photo here to just give you a sense of what it looks like and what we're actually seeing. Okay, you can go to the next slide, please. So I did want to give a little bit more of a background for in terms of the imagery of what you're seeing in in annexation and what that means throughout the years, because what we're seeing today certainly isn't what it has looked like even 10, 15, but certainly not a decade ago. So what you're seeing in 1918 here is under Ottoman rule. And this is when we kind of started to see the more accumulation of land by Jewish individuals and communities, including the Jewish National Fund, which began to make land purchases throughout Palestine for Jewish settlement. And this is at the same time that the Balfour Declaration, a document which is quite controversial in this context, was established. And then in 1947, you're starting to see more of that accumulation of land, specifically through privatization, while the Ottoman ruling of land actually identified a lot of group rights and group recognition to land. 1947 was when you started to see the implementation of the privatization of that, individual rights to land, people now being issued like land certificates, which wasn't necessarily the way that traditional communities have lived prior to that. And then in 1960, you're seeing a land that looks quite different. This is following the Nakba, or the catastrophe in English, which displaced over 700,000 Palestinians. This is when the State of Israel is also created and has enacted further laws and legislations that are in contention with a lot of the rights to land ownership that were previously held in this area, as I'd mentioned earlier. And then this is just from a few years ago in 2017. You're seeing even more of that fragmentation of land, specifically with the establishment of settlements, as Izzeddin discussed. Okay, we can go to the next. So one thing that was really interesting as this conversation of annexation started to come up more in mainstream media when Netanyahu made his announcement was that a lot of Palestinians and Israelis said, okay, well, Netanyahu named it, but really annexation is already happening because you are seeing an appropriation of land. You're seeing a division as a result of the Oslo Accords. The West Bank was divided into 3 areas, Area A, B, and C. They all have different designations in regards to their civil and military status. So 60% of the West Bank is Area C. This means that that area is already under full Israeli military and civil control. So those are areas like Izzeddin had mentioned, where you're going to see like roads that are enacted just for settlers to go to and from Israel proper into the West Bank to get to settlements. You're going to see the differing of resources, including electricity. So some Palestinian communities on the ground don't have access to electricity, but the settlements, which are sometimes like right beside them, 5-10 meters away, they do have access to that grid, to that electricity, to water resources. So this is a division that we have already been seeing happening. This isn't just because Netanyahu declared annexation, but in fact, this is ongoing. And of course, lives between Palestinians and Israelis look very different. And that is partially also because there isn't any room for communication. A great example of this is I was working with some close communities, some Bedouin communities in the South Hebron Hills, and we had a really long day, some quite exhausting work. And so we just wanted to relax and play a game of soccer, which, as many of us know, is a universal tool of communication, right? Everyone can play soccer. And so we started playing and we were having a great time. Everyone was enjoying themselves. The ball rolls over, someone gives it a great boot, and it goes directly over a fence. This fence was actually a border to the settlement of Carmel, which is right beside the Palestinian community of al-Her. And I was like, oh no, I guess we'll have to go get the soccer ball. And my friends who are from the community kind of laughed at me and said, well, we can't go get the soccer ball. Like, we have no way of going over there. They wouldn't let us in. We're not Israelis. We don't have rights to live there. And that's when it kind of shocked me. Like, this is a lived reality for so many people. They can't even go next door to see their neighbors to retrieve their soccer ball. So I think that speaks to the larger context, the macro context of what it actually looks like for life for Palestinians and Israelis in this process of annexation and in this fragmentation of land that you're seeing. Okay, next slide, please. So while we're trying to contextualize exactly what annexation looks like, and what that term means, what changes could be portrayed as a result of that, I think it's important to consider different aspects. Specifically, whose land are we looking at when we're talking about annexation? The state of Israel has declared annexation for a purpose in some ways, and whose land is actually going to be impacted the most, I think is a really important consideration to be given to. The Oslo Accords were drafted with the intention of being phased out within 5 years of their implementation. We're now 20 years past that point. And so that if that was not a sustainable solution, making changes without any form of communication or multi-party, multi-stakeholder communication across peoples isn't going to be a sustainable solution either. It's also important to consider the communities that will be impacted. Like Izzeddin had said, this is impacting not only Palestinians on the ground, but also Israelis who are living in 1948 borders, Israelis who are living in settlements, and Israelis who are living at outposts as well. Those all have different implications. But in particular, if there is a breakdown of communication or further flare up of conflict, that will impact all of those communities. So those are important aspects to consider as well. And then what is the difference between the status quo and proposed annexation? So many people were saying annexation has already been happening. Well, what differences does it look like to be thinking about if annexation were to happen in a more formal sense? What does that look like? What are the implications of international law? Because there are international laws that are actually holding Israel as a nation state accountable, and yet we don't see that being presented on the ground for communities who, can't go next door to their neighbors and retrieve the soccer ball that's kicked over the fence. So these are all really important things to consider. And I think we're going to go on to the next slide. And I'm going to pass it over to Izzy. He's going to share a little bit more about his vision, and beyond the context of annexation, what does conflict transformation look like?
Thank you, Leah. Thank you very much. Leah, actually, if we can go back to the slide where block B and A and B and C, D, if you can share that slide. I just want to mention something if possible.
Yeah, 1 minute.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I am actually, I live in a village where we are designated a block B or, quarter B. For me as a Palestinian, my country has many quarters, many blocks, many lines, many checkpoints. In fact, as a Palestinian, I am so divided up into so many quarters and so many areas that I find it so many times, it is very hard to list and to explain all at once. I'll mention what it means for a Palestinian to live in Area B. A Palestinian living in Area B means that they are not in control of their own electricity. We are not in control of our own water. Our water comes to us from a nearby settlement. So when the settlers feel like or want to shut off their main water source, we can go 2-3 months with no water. Land in Area B, yes, it is controlled by the BA, but only in certain parts of Area B. We were actually recently looking at a small plot of land to add to our existing farm in Area B. Half of that land happens to be in Area B, and 250 meters of that land happen to be in Area C. We couldn't go on and purchase the land, because the half of that land was in Area C, and therefore the Palestinians cannot own or farm or build on that land. It is the same land, but there is an imaginary line where B ends and C starts. And that is a very hard thing to live with and to imagine. And of course, people who live in Area B are yet also controlled by which entry points they have to use and can use. In my village, there is a certain road leading to my village for Palestinian Arab citizens, and next door or next to our street, there is a certain highway designated for settlers only. And those two streets uh, are designated. There is, you as a Palestinian cannot use the settler highway, and vice versa. And many times I start to imagine and reimagine life in Area B as if it was without these borders, without these lines, without these blocks, and what would that look like? So when I imagine those, I think of the people living in that area and what conflict transformation could mean and would mean for them. Imagine if people living in Area B could farm freely, can water their plants freely, can visit their farmland freely, can raise their children without the fear of going close to a fence or close to the settlement. As kids, we were told to stay at least 6 kilometers away from the fence of the settlement just to be safe. Imagine if all these things were to be removed. Imagine instead of talking about annexation, we talk about peace. We talk about opening up a dialogue between the two sides. So life in Area B, it's very hard. It is military, very militarized and very controlled by the Israeli soldiers and the Israeli military. To be able to move from one part of Area B to another, you definitely have to go through 2 or 3 checkpoints at least. And that's very hard for Palestinians, where you can end up waiting at a checkpoint for 2 or 3 hours at a time. So it is important to talk about annexation, but to also acknowledge that annexation for a Palestinian have already happened. It has been happening since 67 and even beyond that my land has been under full military occupations since 67, and any resolution to the current status quo means or would mean the ending and the stopping of occupation and the engagement and the direct engagement of dialogue ASAP. So just wanted to bring that up to your attention. So for our very shared vision, I have a vision which is very simple. I would like one day, I dream of a day where Palestinians, of course, can learn about the Israeli traumas and the Holocaust and what happened to the Jewish people and that part of history. But at the same time, I want education to be a tool used on the Israeli side to educate the citizen of Israel on what it means to be a Palestinian, the traumas and the wars that the Palestinians went through, and the land that they've lost. What it means to be a Palestinian and living under occupation. What does the Nakba mean for us? What does that mean for the generations that are now third or fourth generation living in refugee camps without any sight or close sight for future vision or for peace? What does it mean for people who are living in refugee camps in neighboring countries, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and so on and so on? What does that mean for Palestinians to have a state of their own, to be able to say and see their own country on a map one day? So education is definitely one of the key factors here that hopefully we can use one day or can implement to educate young people and to provide an environment where Palestinian children and Israeli children are able to come together. And you can see a lot of those examples happening in the ground in Palestine and Israel, where communities, organizations, institutions are working towards promoting peace on both sides, but it is definitely not an easy job or an easy work. So I hope we can see more of that in the future. Secondly, as I talked about the checkpoints and how they prevent Palestinians from movement from one area to another, from one city to another. One day, I hope that the Palestinians can freely move from one place to another, from one city to another, and to have the ability to meet people from the north and the south and the west, and to be able to, get out of this designated areas, to remove the designation A, B, and C, to have Palestine, to have a place where I can call home, to have a place where I can proudly see and identify on a map, where I can say, this is my country, and to be able to go to any city I want in my country without being stopped, searched, and told to go back and not be permitted to go through. And finally, and this is a very big piece for a lot of the Palestinians, is to be recognized as a human, for our human rights to be recognized, and of course to have our state recognized, or existing to be recognized internationally and on the map. These are small dreams, but they mean a lot to many Palestinians, and we hope that one day we can engage and talk about those dreams and visions with our neighbors, with the Israelis. And here through JISR, we try to promote these shared visions and try to open space for dialogue. And many times we disagree. I'm not going to lie. We have lots of disagreement and we don't see eye to eye. But at the end of the day, we try to use empathy and build empathy and relationships to build further understanding of one another. So those are some of the visions. And hopefully one day I can go to Palestine for a visit and be able to move freely and travel the country without being stopped. Thank you. I'll do that for you, Senior. Can you see, Leah?
No, but did you want me to share it?
Sure.
Okay.
And you can talk about it.
Sure. Well, I know you're always free to share as well, Izzeddin, because
thank you.
I enjoy listening to you just as much as anything else, Yeah. So yeah, just to further expand on that, a shared vision for Israel and Palestine, I think it recognizes the rights of all peoples in the land. It acknowledges that there are power dynamics at play, but really people need to be put first. The threat, the fear, the trauma that people live with needs to be addressed. And how can we really engage with conflict transformation in this process? Like Izzeddin mentioned, many Israelis and Palestinians want to get to live together peacefully. We see that on the ground. We see that in dialogue groups, cultural events, communities that choose to intentionally live alongside one another. One example being Neve Shalom or Wahat al-Salam is an intentional community where they bring together Palestinians and Israelis just to be together and live in community. But what does this look like for people who do have threats to their homes or for home demolitions, or Israelis who may be fearful of bombings destroying their lives, for people who have had these collective traumas and this multi-generational trauma? If we can just find a narrative to start that conversation in open space, then we can really go forward with finding peace and justice amongst the terrain, and really looking at like that really first step that Izzeddin said of education, I think, which is why we're gathering here today. And it's why I think people continue to gather in all times. They want education and they want to share in the presence of one another and share their stories and be able to engage with others for peace and justice and human rights. Izzeddin, if you want to add as well.
Thank you, Leah. I don't think I have much to say. I think it is important to just acknowledge that there is lots of pain and trauma that are happening on the ground on both sides. But it's also important to acknowledge the strength and the resiliency of both people. As a Palestinian, I know my people are resilient. My people have been through a lot, and we are still on the ground, and we're still opening our doors and saying we want peace. We want to live with our neighbors, and we want to acknowledge their traumas and learn about their histories as well. As a Palestinian, I'm very proud to call Palestine home, even with all of the designations and all the areas and all the A's and B's and C's. But it is home for me and for my family. I am a very proud farmer. The land has shaped who I am. It will shape my family for generations. But at the same time, I wish and hope one day to be able to visit Palestine and to freely drive and walk and travel through the country without stopping at the checkpoint, without having to carry an identification card that says so and so is from area A or B, or I have to apply for a certain permit to be able to go from one city to another. Those are dreams that have been with me since I was a child, and I hope one day to be able to live them. So thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, and thank you to your institution for allowing us the platform to speak about those. And we are, of course, still learning, and we're still trying to share the human face of this conflict, as it is very human and very humane, and as it is full of love, and as it's full of emotion on both sides. The media makes it very hard to see that human face to the conflict sometimes. But by talking about it, by engaging with it, we are hoping and hopeful to bring awareness about this and to try to educate people. Jisr has been doing a great job to bring people together. We are still young. We're still trying to learn about the conflict. We're still trying to work with conflict transformation tools. But at the same time, we are seeing lots of positive feedback and lots of people who are willing to come and to engage in and within conversations that are very difficult and hard. So I appreciate that you opened up the space again once more for us to come and be guests here and to talk about this. I appreciate Leah, of course, for sharing and shedding her experience. And I appreciate Dr. Mohideen and David for being present and supporting us all the time. And I just want to say thank you again.
Thank you very much. In fact, the pleasure is all ours. And dear audience, now let me bring David Newman here in the discussion. And there's a reason for doing that because I'm sure David would reflect upon his last visit to the land in 2019. And informally, we discussed lots of the aspects of this of his visit and the conflict itself. So, without further ado, Dr. David, please join in the discussion.
I'm delighted to be on this platform with the courageous voices that we've heard. And what I really encourage CRRIC to do is to certainly make sure the platform is available for counterparts from the Jewish community who have the willingness to participate in the same kind of way in this kind of discussion, with a view to maybe then bringing them together in a common dialogue about the common humanity and the common trauma that has been suffered. The perspective of the Jewish people, of course, is that there's a small blip on the map of a huge territory dominated by powerful Arab countries. So they have a huge sense of insecurity, not only because of the history they've had in the area, but of course the history they had with the Holocaust and a long time sense of being persecuted and discriminated against, all justified. But the Palestinian voices have not been heard internationally in the same kind of way, with the same kind of deep understanding. And thanks for the Holocaust museums and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, we know the story of the genocide inflicted on the Jewish people. It would be wonderful to have the Canadian Museum for Human Rights involved in this kind of dialogue in a balanced and compassionate, empathic way, so that it can be demonstrated to the world that this can be done. And if it can't be done in cities like Winnipeg, countries like Canada, with a sense of safety and importance, and with a common sense of the importance of international law and human rights and compassion and empathy, how can it possibly be done in Israel and Palestine? And yes, I had the great privilege with my wife of being part of really a learning trip into both Israel, the state of Israel, and then into the occupied territories of Palestine, hosted by Rotarians, amazing Rotarians, amazing human beings, amazing people that understood each other across the border. But to show the magnitude of this issue is that the Rotarians in Palestine and the Rotarians in the state of Israel didn't speak to each other. They didn't recognize each other as people that they could safely engage in dialogue with. Then the Jewish Rotarians would say, well, the Palestinians Rotarians don't want to talk, and they Palestinian Rotarians would say, we certainly will not talk until our human rights and international law is respected in relation to us. So again, one can see, as you scholars in peace building, peace and conflict resolution, that conflict transformation, as both Leah and Izzy have spoken about, is very necessary. And you, with the interdisciplinary skills, can hopefully contribute to bringing these mainstream people, Israeli and Palestinian Rotarians, together in safe ways to talk to each other in the same way that this conversation took place today. So I come away with this with hope. I come away, however, very humbled, because in our own country of Canada, every time I heard a mention of the kinds of human rights violations and the kinds of suffering and kinds of trauma in the Middle East, I'm mindful that we did this in Canada for generations, from the beginning of Canada and before, to our Indigenous people. So I think we have a lot of common histories, in a sense, that can be usefully examined in the Middle East area, where, of course, we have 3,000 years of Jewish history. We have the Abrahamic religions, all sharing the belief that you love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, what is missing here, and missing between Rotarians, is the sense of who's your neighbor. And the assertion that I have been making is that your neighbor is everyone, everywhere, the generations of the past, the 7 generations ahead, and sentient and non-sentient beings. And the same in the rotary 4-way test, all can mean the same thing. So we have to evolve into that state with the help of scholars and thoughtful people that will talk to each other, so that we can see the human family and all of the essential ingredients for survival on Earth as more important than effectively the kinds of fraction, the kind of friction, the kind of dysfunction that is always the product of conflict. So I come away with hope, humbled, and encouraging more of this. Thank you, Izzy. Thank you, Leah. Thanks, Kauser and Halal.
Thank you very much, David, for, I would say, a very warm and heartfelt expression of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring Dr. Hilal Mohiuddin into our discussion. And Dr. Hilal, you are on now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kausar, and thank you very much, Izzeddin and Leah. It was very engaging and enlightening discussion on your part. I especially learned a lot, and it was nicely complemented by the commentary from David. David's observation is really wonderful, and it really matched with my observation. For some strange reason, I don't know why, I was thinking the same way, that neighbors, what are the problems, main problems around them? We know all the problems over the years from 1967 until now, and everything is there. Every year, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are releasing their reports, and we have all those information in our hand. But the deep division that David mentioned, this is the biggest problem, like the sense of insecurity of the Israeli people, that we are surrounded by all Muslim countries, so anything can happen anytime. That's one of the most important points I think we need to bring into our discussion, and most of the time we shade that, we mask that because of some petty political interest or other things, or our ideological divisions in the line. I categorized it recently. I went through some literature about Palestinian and Israeli conflicts. So not very wonderful insights are coming out actually these days. All are the same thing that we have been discussing over and over again and again, because the conflict is so dense and so intense that we don't really see what would be our main point of departure. Out of that, one thing that I believe today we sorted out, we chalked out, is peace education. That's very important for 4 different dimensions. I'll be discussing those dimensions in as briefly as possible. So peace education, for peace education, 2 ideas came out here. One is like opening space, and another one is like education, okay, collaboration and discussing with people, conversation. I think the word is conversation, the best word is conversation, and then opening space. So for peace education, that's fine. But when we look at 4 dimensions, recently I can refer to you to a very recent article, and probably that would be very enlightening to you as well. The policy analysis of why aren't mainstream Israelis and American Jews supporting Palestinians? That's a very important question. So we have been thinking about an answer to that question over the decades, that why mainstream Israelis, there should be different political views, conservative views and then liberal views and the human rights views, human rights approaches. But in general, why mainstream Israelis and American Jews are not supporting Palestinians? So the answer, to some extent, although it is just the same reasons are again and again said, but I found out 2 very important points mentioned here. So one is, the fundamental problem is that they are trying to construct their identity in a way, Palestinians and the Israelis and Jews. We are unique. This sense of uniqueness is actually deadly. Sometimes it's much deadlier than racism. Very, 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 very deadly to my understanding, because it is the root of all sorts of racism and hatred and then genocidal activities everywhere in the world. So just creating this identity that we are extremely unique, something different, it matches with the idea and ideology of Hitler, the Nazism and Nazism, Hitler, Franco, Mussolini, all these things. So we are going back there, but we are not supposed to go there in 2021. So these measures of making a label that we, the Israelis, are unique, and then the Palestinians, we are unique, is a big problem. We haven't looked into this dimension that seriously over the years. And the second one is another misunderstanding that is taking place all over the world, and people are jumping on the social medias, just taking that like, okay, this is a propaganda, straight, clear propaganda, but from the Israeli side, it is very intense, very strong. And we have seen, I don't want to name the name of the countries. I don't want to name the countries, but there are countries that say, for diplomatic reasons, need a very good relationship with Israel, suddenly come up with some strange narratives that are very orthodox, at the same time very anti-academic and anti-human. Like, okay, wipe Israel off the map. It is heavily propagated. It's a propaganda by some of the countries at some points that, okay, this is the main problem, and these people are the Arab people, and the Palestinians are actually trying to do this. This is their only agenda. But we know that absolutely not. This is not the main agenda. But sometimes they focus on these ones so much that we don't get a clear way out, and people keep misunderstanding the Palestinians. I have seen that very strongly because I was watching the activities of people in social media of my neighboring countries and other countries, and whenever that happens, and when like Trump's policy goes toward too pro-Israeli than ever before, And it clearly shows the arrogance. During that times, the bloggers, some other academics, and other people, they come up with this idea that, okay, these people have only one agenda: wipe Israel off the map. And many people, hundreds of thousands of people, believe that okay, probably this is the main reason. So these are the two biggest reasons. I think uniqueness, the tendency of making unique identity, is a problem. And the second one is the propaganda war that is taking place all over the world. And those who are powerful, I would say here Israel, they are getting the upper hand everywhere. And the others who are already in deep trouble, they are getting into bigger troubles. The last thing that I need to talk about, the diaspora community, Israeli and Palestinian diaspora, those who are living outside Israel, they have a lot to do, but they are remaining most of the time silent. So probably this is the best time at this moment just to think about engaging themselves. The conversation began as we are sensing it very clearly from the discussion of Leah and Izzeddin. They are seriously and sincerely trying to do that. CRRIC is here, and there are many other organizations. We know that we are 100% sincere to progress this mission of peace education. In peace education, we need to really chalk out a concrete plan and find out the root causes. I always say that RCA is the best thing, best solution, root cause analysis. And probably in today's discussion, it is very effective discussion, and we got these two root causes that, okay, the human rights issues, considering people as human, all are human, we need to get rid of that preoccupation that we are unique. Probably that should be one important topic for our discussion in peace education and conflict transformation. That, okay, don't get into that trap. It would be trapping all communities, and it will be making this conflict even much worse and unsolvable in the long run. So we need to get rid of these ultra racist narrative building. Probably our peace education should focus mostly on that. And also you will have to fight, especially the human rights organizations and other community organizations. I would again and again say that the diaspora communities from these two territories, those who are living outside their countries, they can play a great role against the propaganda war. Because that will make people victim and victim and victim again, and we will be forgetting to treat other humans as humans. So that should be the main, our umbrella focus, umbrella goal. Umbrella goal would be that, okay, we need to be treated as humans. Palestinians, indeed, they need to be treated as humans. Then finally, the last words of David, I am fully 100% agreeing with him that we need to hear all the voices from all the parties so that they can openly reflect their problems and we can get a good solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hilal. At this stage, we'll take just a couple of questions from the audience, and there are in fact many questions. And just to be conscious about time, we won't be able to show all. Let's take the first question from Mr. Tausif, and here it is flashed on the screen. And we request any one of the panelists to briefly address it. Keep your response brief so that we can take one or two more questions. Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah. I didn't get a chance to read the whole question. Did you, Leah? Okay, annexation. Well, first of all, I think Israel has a very important obligation here to fulfill, which is to stick to United Nations resolutions. There are many resolutions that called upon the Israeli government to end to end occupation and to stop the immediate building of settlements in the West Bank, and of course confiscation of land and so on and so on. I think by fulfilling its duty to the international community, Israel will do two things. One, uphold international law, and second, actually fulfill its own vision of democracy, as it claims to be the only democratic country in the region. By doing so, Israel can then pave the way to start real negotiations with the Palestinians. At this point, the Palestinian Authority, the PA, the representative of the Palestinians in the West Bank, had refused to engage in direct or indirect conversations and discussions with their Israeli counterparts, especially if the Americans are the brokers. So a mindset has to change, attitude has to change, and of course policies have to change. The Palestinians, on the other hand, have to recognize that also Israel has the right to exist, but at the same time, Israelis, the society of Israel, the people of Israel, along with their government, must recognize that the people of Palestine living in the West Bank are occupied, and occupation must end immediately.
Thanks, Izzeddin. Oh, I would just like to add also, I think to have sustainable peace, you have to have leadership and parties that are willing to come forward to the table. We haven't seen that type of leadership established or those relationships really connected between governing bodies within Israel and governing bodies within Palestine. So I think there has to be a sustained peace that's garnered through leadership also within those parties. And we see movements both within Palestine and within Israel to usher for that work and those changes to come about as well.
Thank you very much, Leah. So the next question is, I think, addressed to Izzeddin. And what are the challenges you see in dialogue?
This is a very important question, and a question that I work with a lot. Someone who is currently working on a PhD in peace and conflict, trying to write about interreligious dialogue between the Muslim and the Jewish community in Winnipeg. The role of dialogue, political dialogue, and other types of dialogue between the communities to bridge these communities and to create a two-way conversation between them. Some of the challenges, of course, the misinformation, the lack of education on both sides, the fear that stems on both sides from getting to know one another. One of the things that we found through JISR is that it is very hard to get people to come to a place where they can engage in conversations for a variety of reasons. One of them is the fact a lot of times people don't want to be associated or recognized to be on one side or another for a fear of losing community support, for other fears. But to try to promote this, the diaspora has a very important role. And like Dr. Muhyiddin said, the diaspora has a lot to offer. And we can use the Irish example, the Irish diaspora in the United States, to have a very important role to finding a solution, a lasting solution in Northern Ireland, which helped construct the Good Friday Agreement. So the Palestinian and Jewish diaspora here in Winnipeg and in Canada has a very important role to play. As JISR, we're trying to take small steps towards engaging people in first opening up dialogue about who they are and what their vision is to be a fair and just solution for both parties, but also to get to know one another. When we come together through JISR, sometimes a lot of times we don't know who we are, we don't know our narratives, we don't know much about each other. So we're trying to find a platform where people from both sides can share their narratives, talk about their history, talk about their background, and to try to implement their dreams and visions as a vehicle to help improve our relationships in Winnipeg. The challenge, of course, is major. We sometimes find ourselves in a place where older generations are not on the same page as the young generation. So it is important to continue this dialogue and to talk about the conflict from a different and alternative point of view. It is important to reimagine the conflict. And as someone once told me, if you want to turn an enemy to a friend, you must start talking to them.
Thank you very much. Very well said. I'll take the last question from the audience here. Is from Koazo. And this is what he has to say. And I just wanted to add another aspect to this question is about because this is another question launched by another I would say audience. The accord which is mentioned here is called Abraham Accord, signed at White House in this early of this month between three parties: United States of America, UAE, and Israel. So this is what the question is about, and we would request the panelists to briefly comment on that.
You want to go ahead, Leah?
Sure. I think it depends on who you are asking in that context. There are certainly people who are going to see this as a first step towards, creating neighbors or a context that Israel might actually therefore be able to transition their role as an adversary to all of their neighbors into something that's a bit more amicable. But unlike other peace deals, the UAE actually hasn't had contact with the Palestinian Authority since 2014, I believe. And at the same time, so you're not seeing that engagement with the stakeholders of Palestine. And so it is, I think, a difficult contract for Palestinians to take as legitimate, and to hold themselves, or to believe that the UAE is going to hold Israel to account for some of those things in that contract or in the peace deal is a difficult thing to speak on right now, too.
Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead,
And
please.
to also mention that this deal, what you have to ask the question: what does it offer the Palestinians? What could it offer the Palestinians? And all the Palestinians would agree that it hasn't offered them much. As Leah mentioned, it's in the BA, the representative of the Palestinians have been frozen since 2014. So there was no real relationship between the two Arab countries. Yet, at the same time, how could an occupied person or persons establish a peace, or a comprehensive, lasting peace, a fair peace with an occupier? So a place of a dialogue. A dialogue has to start with ending occupation, to actually start to imagine, to construct real peaceful peace. What usually happens in this context, and we saw this example with Egypt, with other countries in the region, these two countries may sign a peace deal, or normalize, or move towards normalization of relationships. But what usually ends up happening is negative peace, or political peace, where the government unities are talking to each other. There is diplomatic relationships, but the people on the ground of the two countries are not on the same page. So to actually have a comprehensive peace, a peace that includes people from both sides, people from the ground, people who actually can and have hold stakes toward stakeholders, toward implementation of real peace. An important place to talk about and start is occupation, to end occupation, and to allow the Palestinians to decide their own fate.
Thank you very much, Izzeddin. And that formally ends our session. And before I close today's discussion, let me also add a couple of points that is happening along the line of Abraham Accord, which has recently been signed, as I mentioned, and how it is bringing a paradigm shift, as claimed by many of the observers, those who monitor Israeli-Palestinian conflict since 1967. I am just trying to quote some of the aspects which has been written in it's an online, very, I would say, renowned journal. It's called Council on Foreign Relations and CFR. It has a very candid expression and explanation of this conflict. But within this piece, something is very interesting to mention and share with you, dear audience. Here is an op-ed published by Emirati ambassador to the United States, and which was taken up by one of the, I would say, Israel's largest daily newspaper, Yadiot Aharonot. And I'm just trying to read just one or two lines from there, because it is important to understand what annexation, I mean, although we have heard from the panelists that annexation started happening since 1967, but what this particular annexation actually means on ground. So the United Arab Emirates ambassador, Mr. Youssef Al Otaiba, and he's saying that a unilateral and illegal seizure of Palestinian land defies the international consensus on the Palestinian rights to self-determination. It will ignite violence and send shockwaves around the region, especially in the Jordan, whose stability is often taken, particularly Israel. And this is what I just read from the news Israeli newspaper. And this is important that UAE's stance is viewed and is critiqued by Palestinian authorities, outrightly rejected by the authorities. But on the other side, the supporters of this accord saying that it would stop Israel to formally start the annexation process and possibly have some spaces open for future dialogue and peace. So this is what is happening here. And Al Arabiya, one of the lead newspapers published from US, they have titled this whole accord as the UAE-Israel Abraham Accord is the mother of all deals. And Walid Fares writes about the positive aspects of this deal, but it is highly contentious. Nonetheless, Foreign Policy, another lead newspaper and the online magazine, says normalization deal between Israel and UAE signals a shift in the region. Nonetheless, I just wanted to share with you these couple of interesting, changes that is unfolding in the region. So I mean, just to conclude our today's session, let me focus a couple of important aspects that we all heard from the panelists and the observers today. First is the question of peace and security. So these two aspects kind of intermingled and tied together. And as you have rightly heard from our Rotarian and peace builder, David Newman, the insecurity of Israel felt since 1967 onward has really caused this over militarization of the whole idea and whole conflict. So peace and security is coveted by both the parties. Israel also wants to be living within the peace and security, and so are the Palestinians. And this is what is important, that we observers from the far place, when we look at the conflict, we try to understand or maybe we prioritize the peace and security of one party at the cost of others, and that needs to be kind of taken seriously. And the reason I'm saying, and I don't want to repeat, because there are numerous researches, articles, op-eds written and shared, I'm sure, over this past 30-40 years on this conflict. But this is one of the aspects that we often forget when we negotiate between the conflicting parties, that we tend to prioritize one over others. So this is what I just wanted to say here. Second point, violence. We always talk about Israel-Palestinian conflict in terms of violence. And this is what is really very problematic, that particularly in this conflict, that it's a vicious cycle of violence that has been ongoing for years and years. And our heart goes out to both the Palestinians and Israelis, those who are victims of violence. And this is what is important in today's world. And a student of peace and conflict like Izzeddin, we would like to say that violence must be stopped at some point just to break this cycle. If the violence cannot be broken at some point in time, then it goes on and on. That's what we see today. And as we are talking, just the last couple of days, there is again another round of bombing in Gaza, as we all know. It's also interesting to see human rights in terms of both the parties. Both the parties deserve human right to live, as I said before, in peace and security. Human rights is non-negotiable. And whether we refer it back to Universal Declaration of Human Rights or some instruments that we have written in the past, it doesn't matter. Actually, on the ground, in reality, we have to understand that both parties deserve to be given and deserve to have human rights. And dear audience, if you are interested, please tune in the last episode in CBC's one of the good podcast which I always listen ideas. And one of the topic yesterday that I was listening was about walls. So there was a book, and the author was interviewed in that podcast, and he studied walls all around the world, and he had a particularly interesting insight about the wall in the occupied territory, as Izzeddin mentioned in his presentation. So walls, we can build walls, but in his research, the author was saying yesterday that walls cannot stop the resilience of resistance. It is proven, research proven, history proved it. Berlin Wall collapsed at the end of everything. So walls, yes, we understand walls are built to provide security, but the real security is when people understand each other's vulnerability and guard against each other's vulnerability. That is the security. Wall does not provide, cannot provide security. Another point that I'm borrowing from Izzeddin's insight, dialogue. Yes, there are challenges and all, but as a student and educators in this field of peace and conflict, we both believe that dialogue must go on. This cannot be stopped. And this is what we call transformative dialogue in our field, because it is aimed at transforming the relationship of both the parties or multiple parties, those who are embroiled in the conflict. So this dialogue must go on, and this is why I'm very proud to share our platform, CRRIC's platform, to all the parties. And of course, well, we have heard David's call to open up for any interested our brothers and sisters from Israel, our brothers and sisters living in Winnipeg, Jewish brothers and sisters. Anybody would like to share their ideas with us, please send me a note, and I'll be more than happy to arrange number of episodes on this topic. And especially you have heard Geezer, the initiative that Izzeddin has launched. So please come and join, share your perspective, and that is how we will build peace. And finally, statelessness is one of the dominant topics in the conflict of Israel and Palestine. And Palestinians are stateless technically, and though some of the recognitions has been given. And this is why we felt very close when we have received the request from Izzeddin to hold an episode on this conflict, because we study Rohingya conflict, as most of you are aware. And Rohingyas are another very unfortunate group of human beings, those who are made stateless. So stateless is a very dominant and common theme that intrigued CRRIC to undertake the dialogue of today. And let's hope that this is the first one in this series for the future. And I just would like to end today's session by inviting, by appealing to all the audience, those who are listening today, that let's dream with Izzeddin. Let's dream and hope that Izzeddin can go back to his land undeterred, and he has the freedom of movement. He can, live in his land without any fear of any kind of fear. And this should be the ideal dream of every human being in this world. And this is what I just wanted to say. And before we finally close, we'd like to go back to our two esteemed panelists for and thanking them to share their ideas. And I echo with David that it's a very courageous steps for both of them, because there's a danger of being, of course, portrayed you to be in one side and us to be in the other side. So Izzeddin and Leah, thank you so much. If you have any final words for the audience, it is your time. And after that, we'll say goodbye to all the audiences and today's session. Let's hear from Izzeddin if you have any final words.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. What a moving words, and much appreciated. And again, thank you for allowing us to use your platform, which is a great, powerful platform to share our voices. My one last remark is I would like to invite anybody, just like you did earlier, from anyone in Winnipeg to come and join us for more conversations. Usually we meet once a month. Right now we're meeting virtually. Please shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to leave my information after the session, or look up Jisr, and you can connect with us that way. We are a group that is expanding, and our main goal is to promote dialogue between different communities, but here in Winnipeg, but mainly the Jewish Palestinian community, by simply building bridges. So if you want to build bridges with us, please let us know, and thank you again.
Leah, please.
Yeah, I'll just once again thank CRRIC for hosting and Dr. Ahmed for moderating this panel. It's been delightful to be able to hear these other voices in our conversations, and I think it's important. Someone once mentioned to me how tolling heart work and human rights and care work, including ensuring peace and security for all peoples, is. But for us in this context, if we feel like it's tolling, imagine how those who are experiencing it firsthand feel. And so I think it's for that reason that we really need to continue this work for peace and justice and human rights. And I join in Izzeddin's dream and the dream of all people who are displaced or away from home to be able to return. So thank you again for hosting.
Dear audience, so we are formally closing the session today. Those who have tuned in, you have heard the panelists, so please drop in and join the dialogue and build bridges. And that is the concluding theme of our today's session. And we'll be hoping to see you again. So panelists and the esteemed observers, thank you so much for coming in. Have rest of the day nice and easy, and be safe wherever you are, and be peaceful. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.